I don't know if there's really anything exciting about copyright, but
I'm actually pretty excited about copyright. I mean, I think probably some of you were in that last session where at the end there was some discussion about how the emergence of controlled digital lending might be bringing bringing copyright and ILL to the foreground. And it's going to be so interesting seeing that. And I think that is happening. I completely agree that that's happening. And I think it's fascinating how much we're almost focusing on like bending the piece of law that's about physical items, right? And that's kind of been brought to the forefront, while also we have to deal with, well, how are we going to deal with our articles? So that's more what I'm going to talk about today.
So since you guys are go ahead and put that stuff in there, I'll go ahead and get started. I'll do the housekeeping part, and then I will hand it over to Kay. Welcome to session 5 of the 20th annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan Resource Sharing Conference. NWILL wishes to acknowledge the territory that called North America, now primarily occupied by descendants of European colonizers and other immigrants, is the rightful land of the indigenous Native American and First Nations population. We are all responsible for understanding the history of colonization and genocide of the indigenous people, and must commit to learning, building relationships, sharing stories, and taking action to support indigenous sovereignty, priorities, and actions. We encourage you to learn about the indigenous peoples to whom the land you occupy rightly belongs. Please visit the document section of the conference platform to learn more. Today is September 2nd, 2021. This session is titled Copyright Evaluation and Payment Workflow, and will be presented by Kay, who is the Resource Sharing Librarian at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. My name is Pam Kindelberger, and I am the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with the permission from the presenter. They retain the copyright information that they are presenting and may request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWILL committee chairperson. However, at this time, it is planned that recordings will be available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when the recordings are available. To turn the live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitle. If you have any questions during the sessions, please use the Q&A in Zoom, and I will pose these to Kay at the end of her presentation. The door prize keyword will be revealed between the presentation and the Q&A. Please see the door prize link in the Event Mobi menu. When the Zoom webinar ends, please complete the post-session survey in Event Mobi located at the bottom of the session page. On that note, I will turn the session over to Kay.
Thanks very much, Pam. Hi, everyone. I'm Kay Zdepski. I'm coming to you from the East Coast at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm going to talk to you about creating new interlibrary loan copyright evaluation and payment workflow, specifically how we did it at my institution, and some things that I think are pretty broadly applicable as many other people are starting to consider moving away from the CONTU guidelines. So first off, we need to talk about where we are. So I'm going to give a little obligatory background of the CONTU guidelines. I'll talk about the resources that we used at UMass Amherst to figure out what we wanted to do next, how we actually put those policy changes in place, what our new workflow is right now, and some of the takeaways and recommendations that I think are really useful for anyone who's thinking about doing this at their own institution. So first, a little background. As many of you know, the CONTU model, which the vast majority of libraries in the United States use as their mechanism to comply with copyright law for article sharing, states that we need to pay license fees after the 5th article borrowed from the same journal published in the last 5 years. It also states that we need to avoid requesting more than 6 copies of chapters or small portions from non-periodicals such as books while those items are under copyright, and that we need to keep records of successful copy requests made in the last 3 years. It's really important to remember that the CONTU model, even though it's frequently called the rule of 5, is just a suggestion of 5. It's one mechanism. It was made by the Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works back in 1978 as one way for libraries to help follow copyright law. It was meant to be revised 5 years later and has not been touched since. As far as I can see, there's no plan or likelihood that the CONTU model itself is going to be updated. And it was made at a time, it was very much in response to the scary new technology of copy machines, of Xerox machines. Our industry best practices at this point, looking at the ILL code and the RUSA STARS Rethinking Resource Sharing checklist, both state that ILL needs to comply with copyright law and to be aware of guidelines, but no longer states anything about CONTU itself being a best practice. And that's a pretty important shift in our thinking. It's no longer really controversial, I think, at this point to say that CONTU is outdated, and it's not necessarily a best practice, although it is one way to comply with copyright law. So some resources as we started thinking about this. First off, I was lucky enough to get a copy of Georgetown University's analysis before it became more available, because my colleague Laura Quilter, who is our copyright librarian at UMass Amherst, was in touch with her colleagues there. Their analysis says that CONTU is not and has never been law. It was published at a time when scholarly research and publishing was dramatically different. They have some really great charts about looking at the costs of subscription and sort of use numbers back in the 70s versus now. So CONTU guidelines can operate as sort of a safe harbor for ensuring that a library is being copyright compliant if they don't have the staff time or expertise to make up a different evaluation. But elsewhere, it might make more sense to create new mechanisms to follow copyright law. I also found immensely helpful and highly recommend a presentation from the Resource Sharing Conference in 2019 called An Alternative to CONTU. It was co-presented by Brian Miller from Ohio State and Amanda Rudd from Georgetown University. I believe this recording is still available on their website. Each of them walked through what the process looked like at their university. And that was really helpful for me to be able to say, not only when I started going to people in my library and saying, we want to do this, I can point to other libraries who are sort of blazing the trail and also use them as examples. However, one thing that was pretty obvious right off the bat is that neither of their models were something that UMass could just take wholesale, because we are an order of magnitude bigger than their libraries. And as such, our request volume is an order of magnitude bigger. And the models that they had in place weren't something that we could do kind of practically, efficiently, in a timely manner, but really, really useful as we were getting started to look at. We also made heavy use of a 2020 ARL White Paper. Again, Laura Quilter from my university was a co-author on this paper. It is more than 43 pages. It is 43 pages long, but it is written in very accessible language. It's very practical, and it is available open access. I have the link here in the slide. This white paper also concludes that the CONTU guidelines are outdated and should not be relied on necessarily as an appropriate measure of when ILL borrowing exceeds the statutory exemption in 17 USC section 108. They recommend adopting updated, more flexible, appropriate standards in order for a library to comply with the law. So we also just went back to section 108 and read the copyright law itself. I'm not going to read out all of this, but it's important just to go back to the source, right? The really important thing that we kept focusing on is the piece of section 108 that essentially says libraries can share with each other, can share copies of materials, provided that we are not sharing in such aggregate quantities as to substitute for a subscription to or purchase of the work. And that's what we decided to really focus on, is that question of what is a substitution for a subscription. That's what CONTU originally was trying to answer, and what I don't think CONTU really answers anymore. So for our process, I also want to just jump back and talk a little about UMass Amherst. So again, we're a public research and land grant university. We have 1,300 faculty and over 30,000 students. And as such, we're typically processing more than 30,000 lending, more than 20,000 borrowing, and more than 5,000 document delivery requests every year. We need policies that are easy to apply consistently, that can be put at least in partial automation. I cannot be hand evaluating something of the neighborhood over 10,000 of what those borrowing requests would be article requests. I can't do that. We use ILLiad, which means that we do have a lot of access to our data and being able to make custom queries. We lend through OCLC, Rapid, web form, email, carrier pigeon, however you get a request to us, we'll probably share with you. And we borrow through OCLC, Rapid. We do use reprints desk. We purchase directly from publishers, and we're sometimes working through emails with authors or any other means that we need to use. So we need to be taking into account cases where we have already purchased an article and paid fees through reprints desk or directly from a publisher or through some other means. We're members of the 5 College Consortium, the Boston Library Consortium, IDS Project, and a large number of rapid pods. So what I started by doing was making a formal request to the department heads, sort of our leadership team at our libraries, because once you start thinking about messing around with copyright, this is a legal issue, and I needed to have official backing before we started making any actual changes. Nobody wants to be a test case, and even more than that, no one wants to be a test case without their higher ups being aware that anything was going on in the first place. I was very fortunate in that, again, my colleague Laura Quilter had been doing a lot of education about copyright and had been very vocal for a long time, as well as being able to point to those other libraries that were starting to move away from CONTU. So I was able to point to all of that information and give them kind of a version of what I just showed you about how CONTU was outdated and we want to do something else, and ask them to endorse our move away from the CONTU guidelines. I also asked them to determine appropriate people to serve on a task force charged with creating the new evaluation process. So that task force wound up being, it was chaired by me, and had a combination of core members and consulting members. A lot of this was kind of shaped by the commitments that people had. So I would really recommend, if you're having a task force to figure out this process at your university, honestly, you want to try and keep it to more like 4 or 5 people. Scheduling was difficult, and we often needed vital information from someone who's a consulting member. So it didn't really work to have sort of 2 sets of people. We also had hoped to have our collection analysis librarian hired and a part of this, because we really wanted to connect the ILL evaluation process with collections development decisions. But that position was being hired just before the pandemic, and unfortunately, we were not able to fill it before we went into a hiring freeze. So as a side note, that position has just been posted. So if you or anyone you know might be interested in a position like that, please check it out. We would love to get somebody in that position. This task force was charged to institute a new form of copyright evaluation and payment that's in alignment with Section 107 and Section 108. We were to improve connections between interlibrary loan data and our acquisitions process, to deliver workflow documentation and a policy, and we were going to pilot the process initially in 2020. Of course, that is when the COVID pandemic caused a shutdown of our libraries. So we didn't actually put the new process in place really until 2021. Although I ultimately used it to pay the copyright costs for our 2020 for 2020 as well. So I do actually have 2 years worth of data sort of on this. The task force started out looking at that white paper, reviewing policies from other institutions, and thinking really hard about what means a substitute for a subscription. We looked at what data we could get out of ILLiad or other ILL sources, what fields of interest were actually available there. It's surprising sometimes how much you can get out and then what seems obvious that is simply not available. There was a lot of interest in what we paid to CCC in the past or what we were currently paying to reprints or to publishers. And we determined what other information we needed, like journal publication frequency was a high interest question, which again isn't often in many MARC records, but is not brought into ILLiad. And whether we had an existing subscription. While we were reviewing this data, we came up with quite a few articles that we had paid CCC for, had looked like they went over CONTU in past years, when in fact the libraries had a current subscription. And that was either something like a database had been down or there had been a mismatch with an ISSN in our holdings, and those requests had gone out to other libraries when in fact it should have been filled internally, and we shouldn't have been paying copyright on those in either case. We considered a number of potential measures. The main ones that kind of floated to the top were whether we could compare typical use, sort of average use metrics for existing subscriptions. This wound up not really being a good option because there's a lot of variation in how much different types of journals are used. And it was difficult to get information, how are we going to compare a physics journal and an English journal or a newspaper, something that publishes really frequently with something that publishes really infrequently? How can we get that data in a way that we can compare it fairly without also being a huge amount of work to compile that information? Another common idea was, could we compare what a real subscription costs for something we borrowed a large amount of with what we would pay through the CCC? And that also wound up not being a really feasible measure because most journals do not put their actual subscription cost in an easily identifiable way. Those subscription costs may be different for different sized universities and often would require a person making a specific request for a subscription cost quote. And that's just not a reasonable, that would add a lot of personal work and time. And what if those publishers don't even respond to us? We needed something that we could do pretty much all on our end. We also thought about journal publication frequency. So again, that came up before. At first, journal publication frequency seemed like it would be pretty impossible to get as well in a reasonable way. But then it turned out that we could run a query using the ISSNs of journals that we had borrowed against an Ulrichs Web API. And out of that, we could actually get a pretty good amount of the journal frequencies, as well as some other information about the journals that we found very useful. So in the end, since we were able to get that, we decided that our primary measure would be saying an average of one article for every other issue published does not substitute for a subscription. We think that that is really, if anything, that's quite conservative, right? You would never say, oh, you used, there were 2 issues and used 1 article and that's a subscription. That's not a subscription. So for example, with the quarterly publication that's published 4 issues a year, if we borrow 6 articles from 1 year, we would pay license fee for 4 of those articles. But if we borrowed 6 articles across 3 years, we would not pay license fees for any of those articles. We also said we would have a secondary measure, which is if requests for a particular title are objectively high, especially year after year, we would consider whether we're substituting for a subscription regardless of other measures. So that's really meant to catch times when, say, there is a publication that's published daily or weekly, so it has a ton of issues, and we're requesting a quite high number of articles. Because the number of issues is so high, that might never trigger the primary measure. But if every year we're consistently requesting many, many articles from that title, we might be substituting for subscription, and we should decide what we want to do about that. We think by this measure, we should sometimes be paying where we would not have paid under CONTU, such as article requests that were published more than 5 years ago. But we also should not pay sometimes when we previously would have. because despite 10 articles from a particular volume year, the journal publishes daily, and that's a relatively low volume overall. It's not a subscription. The benefits over CONTU we think are pretty significant. This meets substitution for a subscription formula. It better matches fair use section 107 factors talking about the nature of the original work, the amount taken from the original work, and the effect on the market. We also think this makes our licensing fees apply more accurately for older publications and to more accurately account for impact on the publisher. This also better provides data for collection development decisions, which can improve our subscriptions, improve the access to things that patrons are making heavy use of, and benefit publishers in that way as well. So our actual workflow to make this happen is still a work in progress. It was really important to us to at least have a policy that can be consistently applied, that if I'm asked a question 2 years ago about why I did or did not pay for something, I can point to our process and it will be a clear answer. It will not be something that's kind of the phase of the moon or how I was feeling about something at a particular time. It's something that a person other than me can also look at and understand and perform. One of the really frustrating things right now is that CONTU is deeply, deeply baked into most ILL software. It is difficult to move away from on that very practical sense of how do we actually make this payment piece happen. What we're doing right now is still a work in progress. It works. I want to make it more streamlined. So throughout the year, IDS Logic is running ISSN normalization on our requests, and requests with ambiguous ISSNs or publication years are going to a staff review queue. IDS is passing on requests. They're taking them out of awaiting copyright clearance without saving any CCC data as they're coming through initially. We're also no longer purchasing through Reprints Desk automatically, although we still use, if it's the best option, to purchase something that way. And I would love for someday to be able to have enough data in ILLiad that it could make automatic determinations about when we want to purchase through Reprints Desk. Someday that might be possible. And then annually, after the requests have cleared, so that's pretty normal, right? Probably February or March, I run a report of all the articles that we've supplied. I am using an ILLiad SQL Querier add-on, which you can get from the Atlas add-ons directory, and I have a saved query, so all I have to do is update the years and run that query. And that also lets me get a list of ISSNs in case we need to run another report in Ulrich's Web. We can use a lot of the same frequency data from previous runs. I also get a list of current journal subscriptions from our IRM department so that we can double check that in advance as we're doing this process and make sure that we don't pay for anything that we already have a subscription for. So to evaluate whether our supplied articles substitute for subscription, again, we're using these measures of we're comparing the number of articles we successfully supplied to the number of serial issues published in the years we supplied articles from. And we're saying an average of 1 article for every other issue does not substitute for subscription. And we're also looking at whether something is objectively high. Another piece of this is I'm making sure to remove articles. I am in fact removing in advance our requests where publication years are in public domain. I'm creating a kind of summary tab with the ISSNs and request counts. I'm using that to match across current journal subscriptions to pull in the Ulrich's Web journal frequency and apply the formula that we created to do those measures. And that here is a snippet of what that looks like. So again, this is right now kind of a massive spreadsheet, and I need this to be simpler than it is right now, but it works. And as you can see on the left-hand side, I actually have a formula that tells me that will list the transactions that I need to pay for based on this measure. And this is something also we're trying to turn into something that can be shared out with our librarians who do collections development and be able to see how that might influence their decisions. We made the decision that we're not going to run this by the librarians who do selecting before making the payment. there are many people at our university who may be a part of the selection process. And that timeline doesn't match up with the timeline of them getting funds to make their decisions. So instead of being able to make these decisions and pay for the articles that need to be paid for, it could have been a really time-consuming process and a lot of prompting people to make decisions. So instead, we're running this, we're making the data available, and we're making sure that we're checking if we have a current subscription. So if someone looks at this and something is being currently, if something has just been purchased, we will catch that. So finally, for the payment processing, I want to update that. I want to do that through Iliad. I want to keep my records in Iliad, so it's the central place I can run reports on that in the future. How this is set up right now is I have a SQL update, which uses that list of transaction numbers from that spreadsheet. It's run by our database administrator, and it sets item info 5 to awaiting or to copyright payment required. IDS logic can then move those requests back through awaiting copyright clearance processing. We're hoping to write a way for IDS to be saving that CCC information. Right now, that's a piece I still have to do manually, but again, it works. And the requests are immediately then routed back to request finished instead of going off and accidentally getting refilled. And that allows me then to request an invoice via Iliad, just like I would if we were still using CONTU. And then, of course, as I said, that's the stage after that where I would share out information to anyone, so anyone can review that and use that to make collections development decisions. I'm just going to check there if we've got any. I see some Q&A in chat, so I'm just going to take a look at those really quick and see if there's something I can address. Okay, so I think I'm going to get to those more at the end. Okay, so some of our takeaways from going through this process. When you start thinking about moving away from CONTU, you'll need to think about what data is actually needed that's in Interlibrary alone, that lives in your ILL management system, and what data is needed from outside of ILL. You may be having a more difficult time if you don't use a system like Iliad that really lets you get into the guts of your data on your own. You may need some help creating reports or accessing the information that you need. You think about the timeline. When should the review occur? Who are the people who need to be kept informed? At our library, it didn't work to bring in people who might be deciding to subscribe to something then and there, but maybe at your library it would. We thought a lot about efficiency and ease of use. CONTU is deeply ingrained in most software. So how do we make a process that doesn't dramatically increase staff workload? What we're doing right now is more workload than just simply using CONTU. I think it's less workload than some other models I've seen. Maybe some of you have even figured out something that's better than what I'm doing. And I would love to hear ideas that you have as we're trying to make this make more sense. And finally, how do we avoid arbitrary numbers and unnecessarily delaying steps in our decision process? How can we ensure a process that's consistent over time, and if different people need to do this? Another piece that I'm asked about a lot is cost impact. So for us, this absolutely is cost savings. I don't ever want to say that this is primarily a cost savings situation, right? We want to do this because we want something that's in alignment with copyright law, something that's going to be improving our subscriptions. This is not purely a cost savings decision, but yes, it does save cost. You can see right here that the amounts paid to CCC. So again, I did this for 2020 and 2021, which is for requests in calendar year 2019 and 2020. I think I saw in the Q&A someone was asking, if we're using a fiscal year or calendar year. We use a calendar year, we have for a very long time, and we're not going to stop doing that. We do use a calendar year for our evaluation. And you see that reprints is quite high, is higher in 2019, and that is because even though we knew that we were going to try this new copyright method, we had not yet turned off sending to CONTU or sending to reprints based on CONTU counts. in 2019. So you can see that there's some pretty dramatic changes happening right there. So with that, I'd like to get into questions. Okay.
Would you like me to read those to you?
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so this one is the rule of 5 articles from the same journal within the last 5 years. If someone was to request 8 articles from a journal that we don't own, if we are 5 within the last 5 years and the others 4 are not, then are we safe?
Under CONTU, yes. Yeah, you're only looking at it's articles that match both. So you would only be considering the articles that are published in the last 5 years. And CONTU just ignores anything that's from older, from beyond 5 years ago.
Okay. Are libraries in copyright compliance if we own the journal? However, the journal, there is an embargo and it won't be available for 18 months. So we send a request trying to obtain it. Would that count towards us in the rule of 5?
My understanding is yes, and this does get a little blurry, right? This is something that when I've talked to my colleague Laura Quilter about, who's much more of a copyright expert than I am, it can get very frustrating when there's simply when a subscription simply does not exist that includes current a current article, or perhaps a print one, and you are subscribing to the most current electronic version. My understanding is that that type of subscription would not count as having a current subscription to get something such that you wouldn't be paying for it for CONTU. If you do have a current subscription and say the database goes down, or you have a current print subscription and the floor that print subscription is held on is inaccessible, and you fill those from other libraries, those would not be applicable to pay copyright for under CONTU. But again, you can start to see how some of this is quite arbitrary, right? And it's not always a nice clean cut answer. But does that answer that question? All right.
Yeah. Okay. So you kind of already answered the next question, which was what defines a year, and that was January to December.
Right. We are making the choice that we are doing a January to December calendar year, but your library might be doing a July-June fiscal year or something else. I think as long as we're all being consistent with our own in our own situation, that's fine.
Okay, the next question is, what do you consider high?
Yep. So we do not have a cutoff, like a specific whatever. We don't have a number that we say if something is more than whatever number, it's high. It's more that we're looking at that spreadsheet. We have, let's see if I have that column. If I go back. So you can see that I have columns here where I'm looking at all of the articles published compared to half the issues, to all of the publication years borrowed. I have this column be objectively high. So this is just a straight out total from the evaluation year from the recent years. So we don't really have a cutoff number, but the idea is that we would be having a look down that column and seeing if there are numbers that are jumping out, and then looking, you can see that going off down to the cutoff piece of this spreadsheet. I actually have data from past years, so you can kind of see, okay, this title here, we requested 32 articles from that. Have we been requesting more than that over the past several years? Is that something that we want to take into consideration there?
Okay. Has a library ever been called out or sued for breaking fair use copyright or fair copyright use?
to my knowledge, no ILL unit has been involved in a court case. Reserves are the ones that are on the front lines right now. There are a lot of very interesting court cases to follow about how fair use and reserves match up. And I absolutely recommend taking a look into that. There's some really interesting stuff. I think one of the things that makes a lot of ILL practitioners pretty cautious is that we don't necessarily want to be on the front lines like that, right? No one wants to be the test case that goes to court and winds up setting precedent for this kind of policy. We don't have an ILL precedent yet, so we're just sort of doing the best that we can and trying to follow the law.
Okay. What percentage of a book do you think can be shared via ILL?
It depends enormously. That's the thing with fair use. In fact, if a book is out of print, if a book is not available for purchase and is out of print, there is a very good fair use argument that a library can and should scan the entire thing in response to a request, if that's the only way that it could be received. Of course, especially if it can't be shared physically. That is also might not be possible under our available work time, because scanning large amounts of books is also very time consuming. And when we have staffing problems and when we have many other patrons we need to support, it's not always a reasonable thing for us to be able to do. But if I've learned anything, it's that any kind of percentage cutoff that you see that says, oh, you can always share X% of a book and that's fair, that's fair use, that's not true. There is unfortunately no clean and clear rule that says how much or how little of something you can scan and for it to be fair. It's sort of its own evaluation every single time about going back to section 107 and thinking about those measures like, well, okay, you can think about how much of this is it. You can think about, we know in our context, we're assuming an academic use, we're assuming research use. You can think about, is this book available anywhere else? Is this book available as an ebook? So we might think about, if a patron is asking for an entire book, but we could purchase it as an ebook, we would never scan that whole thing, right? But there is no nice, clean, and dry way to decide how much of a book is fair use to scan.
This is a follow-up question to the calendar year. So is it okay for a fiscal year?
Yeah, I think you could use functionally the same process in a fiscal year. And again, you probably already are, whatever measure you're using, whether that's CONTU or something else, you might be using it on a fiscal year or you might be using it on a calendar year, and those are equally fine.
Okay, there's one more here. To generate that spreadsheet report, is that done through ILLiad custom report as the base?
It is through ILLiad. I am using the ILLiad SQL Querier add-on. You could do it through ILLiad custom report. I found the SQL Querier add-on to be easier to replicate and to run a little faster. And it lets me set exactly what columns I want to come out in a very specific way. So this is going to look a little intimidating, but what it looks like is I have this query that goes into the SQL Querier tab, and then that spits out exactly what I want. But you could reconstruct the same thing in the ILLiad custom querier, where you would be saying, creation date is between this date and this date, and you want it all to be borrowing requests that are articles that have not been canceled. And that would get you to the same place ultimately.
That was the last question. So thank you for your wonderful presentation. And if you could stop sharing, I will share my screen so that they can get their the slide for the door prize.
Okay, thank you all so much. And if folks have other questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
Share. Oh, all right. So can everybody see that? This Idaho park has rift cracks that are deepest known on the earth. And the answer to that is craters of the moon. It's a really cool park. You should all come to Idaho to see it. Okay, so yeah, it was a great presentation. So you can contact Kay if throughout the conference if you just want to touch bases with her personally and use this platform. Anyway, enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back this afternoon. Thank you.